Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Leaders Summit 2021 and another year of the Asian TV Forum. I'm absolutely delighted this morning to be able to have a fantastic conversation with Ashok Namboodiri, who is the Chief Business Officer at International at Z Entertainment. And I hope that this will be a unique session where we can talk about the challenges and the opportunities ahead. So, welcome Ashok. Thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate it because we know how busy you are. We're having this conversation based in Dubai. You've just got back from Johannesburg, literally overnight. You will be imminently going to London, so we really do appreciate the time. Let's start, I guess, with a brief look back at how 2020 has been and some of your key learnings. The APAC, Asia region is so fragmented, super competitive. So what have you learned about staying relevant in your sector?
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. My pleasure to join you for this discussion today. I think there have been a host of learnings, but let me try and kind of summarize that into three buckets. I think the first bucket really has been about sticking to your core. Given that we've got this tradition of storytelling for about 5,000 years, I think the biggest thing really is stick to what you do best. And we've seen that, when we stick to genres where we've been comfortable with, where we've tasted success, that has worked over and over again. The second one is really about exploring adjacencies. Given that social modes are changing in the Asian markets, we've looked at slight modifications. So for example, from the traditional housewife, we've looked at professions that they're exploring. So chefs, nurses, sports people, those are the kind of adjacencies in terms of content and storytelling that we have done. And the third is we've looked at stories for inspiration. So larger than life, historicals, again, things that have worked for us. Operationally, one of the key learnings has been when it comes to content planning and banking. We've basically, the pandemic has taught us to start looking at larger horizons. So from a 6 months to 1 year, we've started looking at a 3 to 4 year horizon in terms of the way we plan out our content. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be true and stay relevant for a lot of media broadcasters across the world. Third, the point that you just mentioned, which is that the APAC markets continue to remain fragmented. We are seeing increased competition, and therefore I think we're going to see the evolution of new business models, basis collaboration, basis partnerships, and I think that's going to really get accentuated in the days to come.
Okay, well that's a fantastic start, thank you. I think there's a lot of stuff that we can pick up on there. Let's dive into the content strategy and let's come back to what you were, I loved what you were talking about in terms of sticking to your core, but at the same time being flexible enough to understand the adjacencies and what the audience is wanting. So if we talk about your audiences, and again I appreciate that there are multiple segments across different geographies, what's happening with their customer demands? Are they changing what they're watching? Is that driven by the international competition? Is it driven by what you're doing? How do you look at that? How do you track it? How do you work that through into your organization and into the sort of content decisions that you're making?
Yeah, no, I think all players have had a lot of experience in these markets. We've had to go back to our decade-long experience in the Asian markets and really cull out the expertise that we've got in terms of understanding what works in these markets. Specifically, some of the changes that we are seeing is that the long-form traditional kind of format of series is now changing to limited series, and this is working across markets. We are seeing regionalization of OTT players, both in India as well as in international markets, and therefore the tendency to experiment is much more higher. Traditionally we've seen in the APAC markets that we've got basically markets like Myanmar and Indonesia. They react positively to long-form dramas. That is, in a sense, continuing even today. While if I pick up markets like Singapore and Malaysia, the tendency to experiment, the tendency to look at more realistic kind of, even in films, that's something that's evolving, and I think it will continue to accelerate as we go forward. While in markets like Japan and Korea, we still see some of our historicals, the Asian fantasy drama still remaining relevant. So it's an interesting mix where certain things continue to hold sway. Certain markets we are seeing, the tendency to experiment far more than what it is. And in some other markets, it's status quo. So I think while the pandemic in general, for broadcasters coming out of the pandemic, the number of TV viewing hours has gone up. I think the big challenge there is going to be in terms of how you cope with these multiple threads, if I could put it that way, of content preferences. I think for broadcasters like us, one of the things is to stay in touch in a much more focused manner across markets because, traditionally they have been very fragmented, highly competitive. But I think in this space of increased acceleration of content preferences, the need for us to stay in touch with ground changes is going to be far more relevant.
And how are you doing that? Because this is the sort of the key thing, isn't it, for everybody, is there are these consumer changes, they are increasingly demanding. How do you actually stay in touch with them? Do you have people tracking that on the ground? Do you use research companies? How does it work? Yeah,
one of the things that Z's been, first off the block is a direct physical presence in a lot of these markets. Right. And that's something that we are now using to our advantage. Mm-hmm. Because the body of learning that we have picked up over the years, that's now coming to our rescue, if I could put it that way clearly. Second, I think we are investing more time and resources in research, both in terms of structured as well as ad hoc short-term research, and a lot of the inputs that go into our content planning is basis that.
Yeah, sure.
And I think the third thing is we've also taken a little bit of risks in terms of experimenting. Basis the body of expertise that we have in these markets, and some of these are paying off as well.
So can you give me some examples? Because I'm fascinated that a company as large as Z has the ability to flex and be agile around experimentation. So can you talk us through some examples?
Yes. So if you look, there are certain, let me pick up the subject of genres. Documentaries, docu-series, mixed genres, these are exploding. If you look at it, we've seen the advent, at least with regard to Indian and South Asian consumers, we've seen the advent of sports dramas, we've seen dark themes which are becoming more relevant. We've got something called horror comedy which works in the regional markets in India.
Right.
It's not necessary that you go into each of these, but going back to what I said about sticking to your core, we figure out where we are likely to win.
Right.
And, we've basically taken a plunge into some of these ones. The one I'd call out in particular is both in the movies as well as in terms of long format series. We've experimented with sports and sports personalities, and that seems to be paying off for us.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So are you experimenting? Because one of my other questions was going to be, given that there are so many competing OTT producer platforms in your regions, it must be, as it is globally, I think, absolutely renaissance moment for producers who are all, having so much work to do. So how are you coping with the increased volume of content that you're having to produce at the same time as everybody else? Is your existing ecosystem working for you? What are you trying to do differently, again, with this sort of agility and experimentation in mind?
I think one of the fallouts of increased content demand is really pressure on talent, in terms of how do you kind of cope up with both getting new producers as well as getting your existing producers to look at markets with a global perspective.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of what I said earlier in terms of how we are able to quickly get some of these research inputs and market in kind of insights quickly across to the content and production teams, so that we are able to incorporate that into the work that they do. We are also constantly in search of new talent, new upcoming talent, and looking at how quickly we can onboard them and get them to really become part of the team. And I think that's been one of the things that we've been focusing on.
And how are you doing that? I mean, are these people coming from social, digital, YouTube, this sort of thing, and pulling them across, or are you running talent searches? How do you find new talent?
So at Z, we are constantly, in touch with multiple institutions, multiple colleges, etc., and cutting across sections of society for people who are thinking content differently. So that's something that we've accelerated. We continue to do that. Yes, we are looking for people who are working across platforms. So I don't think the earlier classification of saying here's a talent who's working only on linear television or here's somebody who's working only on OTT, I don't think that exists anymore. No. And therefore, how quickly are we able to therefore broad base the kind of talent pool that we have is going to be a determinant to how quickly you can succeed.
Yeah. And just going back to something you said about, the different sort of genres that you're developing per market, are you also trying with these producers to get this content to be more regionalised? I know that's even more difficult, but when you look at, of course I'm going to bring up these examples, but when you look at the success of something like Squid Game, what is Z doing about that? How are you trying to find hits that would go beyond their local market, even beyond the regional market, to be broader than that?
The first point that I would say is absolutely. Regionalization is something that India and Indian content, we've got a right to win. Yes. Because of the sheer number of languages.
That, aren't you?
Yeah. So we've seen that both with regard to domestic as well as international markets, the tendency to look at more regional content is much higher. Audiences are willing to experiment when it comes to regional content, and across the Asian markets, we are finding a lot of our regional content now traveling and getting successful. Okay. And I think that trend is going to stay. What we are encouraging our internal teams is then to make judicious choices in terms of what they are picking up basis the expertise that we have in some of these markets.
Yeah, sure. Okay. All right. So, we've covered a lot of areas. I guess the key question when it comes to your content strategy versus competitors is, and obviously I'm aware that Z is an enormous company with huge regional reach, global reach. But how do you compete with somebody like Netflix, who is ploughing, $17 billion into their content and also has an avowed interest, and a very clearly declared interest in your regions?
Yeah, I think, I would stick to this theme of right to win.
Yeah.
I don't think this is no more a game of content traveling and being able to win all across. I think it's a function of how strategically you make choices in terms of where to play and your right to win. And that's where I go back to the core of sticking to your core, which is really then saying, what are we good at? Where is it likely to succeed, and therefore how do we make it work?
Yeah.
And if you answer those three questions, I think some of those choices become very evident. What we're really doing, therefore, is picking up stories that have traveled widely in the past and saying how can we adapt those stories or those themes to make it work in some of these markets. Increasingly, we are also beginning to see collaborations, whether it's producers, whether it's content partners. I think that's the other way to take on increased competition in the market. That's something that we are picking up not just in the Asia Pacific, but across Middle East and some of the other markets. We believe that's the way forward, and there are obvious synergies in terms of picking the right partners and then going into a market together.
So is there anything, can you be more specific? Can you give any examples on that? Because I think this theme of collaboration is what we're seeing everywhere. It'd be interesting to hear how you're actually doing that.
So one of the things that we believe that we could leverage in the international markets especially is, given our body of work over the last 10 or 15 years, understanding how the consumers react to content, is this theme of co-production.
Right.
We believe, and in the Asia Pacific markets, we are just about beginning to think through our plans on that. But in the Middle East, I can tell you that we've successfully experimented over the last 24 months with co-productions. One, we are constantly looking for partners who can work synergistically with us, both with regard to capital investments as well as with regard to content. And that's something that we intend to scale up and take it forward. In other markets where we believe that the social fabric is similar to India and therefore the chances of success are higher, for example Africa and some of the Asia Pacific markets, we are still evolving our thinking on co-production, but I think that's clearly our way ahead.
And when you say co-production, this is co-financing from other platforms or other broadcasters. How does this concept of collaboration work perhaps with your producers? Do you have a roster of people that you're using more often, or how does that work?
So let me explain that under two buckets. I think one is clearly producers. We are looking at people and creating a roster. We are updating that. Again, looking at various markets differently. That's something that we continue to do. And we are also looking for people who can come forward and we can work with them together in some of the markets that I talked about. The other, I think, is with other broadcasters. I think that's something that we are thinking about. Our thinking is evolving as I speak. But I think there is an opportunity in some of these markets to join hands and look at synergies where we could take, let's say, regional content that's being produced in one market and collaborate with what we have already in our library and then enter a market together. Yeah. I think that's going to be the other interesting thing that's going to evolve in some of these markets.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. We're seeing that certainly in this region. The much more interest and desire to be collaborative and to think about, okay, how does it first window, second window, third window, what is exclusive, what is non-exclusive, and so on. It's far more. Yeah, I mean, I guess the competition is driving that.
Absolutely.
Desire to be more collaborative.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm just conscious of time. Let's talk a little bit about responsibilities that a player like Z has in the sort of content and partnership ecosystem, picking up on some of your themes. So what are you doing in terms of talent development, sort of incubators, funding, script development workshops, things like that? We talked earlier about finding new talent and developing it and the volume of talent that is going to be required at all levels. What's Z's approach to that? We have
over time built up the capability to look at local productions for local audiences, and that would call for setting aside a certain investment fund to manage some of these co-productions. Right. To that extent, we are working with various partners in terms of being able to scale up the level of co-production that we do. I think at the end of the day, it's a function of your business appetite and your ability to invest. And depending on how you are looking at both of those, I think various business models evolve. Some of this thinking is kind of still undergoing change, but I think we are spending a lot more time thinking about the right business model going forward.
Okay. Well, I think that's good. I mean, I'm sure that the community is going to be happy to hear that. I suppose, obviously, financing and IP management is changing. What do we think that the producers could expect from Z in the next sort of 3 to 5 years as you evolve this thinking? I'm assuming a more collaborative approach.
Absolutely. I think, going back to what I said, it's a function of how much appetite you have for investment and what you're willing to experiment. I think one of the things that we are clearly looking at is on the IP front, is there an opportunity to co-own it and to exploit it? And we would be really actively looking forward to partners who can, work with us to try and make content options available. But we are flexible on the business model.
Yeah, well, that's really good to hear, I think, isn't it? Because I know that some of the globals it's a tough conversation for producers with some of those guys.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure that would be hugely welcome. Yeah. And as you've said, you have 5,000 years of storytelling history. So I think finding where those new stories are coming and sort of making them more modern, more slightly different in their thinking, that's really crucial. Certainly that's what we're seeing in this region as well. There's a real push for that. And it's almost like the audiences are ahead sometimes of some of the platforms and certainly the regulators in this respect in terms of what they're wanting to see.
True. I think, I like to believe that we have all the stories in those 5,000 years of history. I think the way in which some of these are picked up and told is going to undergo a lot of change. So we have the advantage of having all the storylines with us. I think, we're looking for people who can experiment, keeping in line, the expertise that we have in the markets.
Yeah, it's interesting, this experiment idea, isn't it? Because it's in theory quite high risk, the level of investment and so on. But I guess if you're making shorter episodes, then it's a question of sort of failing fast and forward, that classic cliche, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And then comes back to the audience tracking. Okay, so to close then, let's have a little conversation. I mean, bearing in mind this, I love this expression, right to win. I'm going to use that one. But what's on the top of your agenda for as we come into 2022?
I think like most players bouncing back from the pandemic, growing share is going to be very, very critical. I think any business plan that doesn't have a mention of the pandemic and how to leverage the learnings from it is not going to be strong enough. So that's clearly on top of the agenda. At Z, we reach about 450 million audiences across the globe currently in terms of direct presence. And if you look at our content that travels by way of syndication, we are about 1 billion in terms of viewers. We'd like to take that to 2 billion over the next 12 to 15 months. So we've set ourselves ambitious goals.
Ambitious goal, yeah.
Yes.
What's that called? It's a BHAG, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think, that's the goal. I think what's more important is how we segment the markets and say, this is where we're going to win. So there are clearly some markets where we'd like to dive deeper, go deeper in terms of taking the India business model and saying this is how we will create a microcosm of that model in those markets. In certain markets, we will stick to the core and say this is what has worked in the past and we'll continue doing the same thing. And in some markets which are probably evolving much faster, we will be looking at experimenting in those markets.
Yeah.
So I think the fun really is going to be in terms of different approaches that we're going to take vis-a-vis what we were doing earlier.
Yeah, horses sort of thing.
Yeah,
That's great. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciated that very meaningful session, and really we thank you for your time. And thank you everyone for staying with us. I hope you've enjoyed that session with all of these exclusive insights from Z. And stay online and also stay on ATF Online Plus for more sessions that are coming up next.